Our first speaker, Samuel Kaleikoa Kāʻeo, is an associate professor of Hawaiian Studies, Department of Humanities at the UH Maui College. Kaleikoa is a proud graduate of Baldwin High School in Maui and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Prior to returning to his hometown, Kaleikoa was a lecturer in the Hawaiian language at UH Manoa, a teacher at the Hawaiian Language Immersion Program at King Kaulike High School, and the Culture and Education Program Manager for the Hoʻolave Island Reserve Commission. Mr. Kāʻeo was born and raised on Maui. He and his family reside in Waiahuli. I give you Mr. Kaleikoa Kāʻeo.
Hey, aloha kakaya kakako. Avelina me ke aloha. Everybody can hear? All right, good. Okay, we on? Yeah, we on. Okay. Nolela. Kulikako ke ala nui kala iwa kalua kumovalu kamahino nove maka. Nove mapa no hoi ka makahiki. Umi kumovalu kanaha kumokolu ai wa kaulana no hoi ka hana ka poe kupuna make ala nui nolela. He la nui ki a la hano no hoi no ka poe kupuna a pela no kako ke maula. Oh maila ula ilai ka pai o kane ka po kini ka po ti tamahu. Hana o lailo no ya tapa hana o tamahina he kane o kamule kane ka makulu hi wahine. O po ele a o ka mo po ele ka o vehi vela vahilo ho la ilai no ya tane. Hana o hi wahine. Hana o hali a he wahine. Hana o ha ke a he kane. Hana o kamuki muka muke ke ku ne nebo. Moku monu mumuliana mumuli vale ana kane kamuli ke o kamawe ka wahine vele vale. Be ye kane ho hana o kame kane keki. Ha vika apu kapu ye ki ino ke mo ya. Ha ili o kane kamuli hele o wale. Ha ili o ki o la ilai. Ika buli lai punia. Pe ka po haku hailuku ya kane o kane ka pahu ki vava ne ka leo. Huhu lili kane moi mulia mailo kana muli haku ai kamahana o mua. Imu ya la ilai, imu ya ki. Ka lawa kamahana o lanila huka. Aloha. Nolela. Kabeli ana ya ukua pau ke ya kakai akanui ka hole e walu. No hoi ma ke ia poa ono ne e ia nae. He la hano no hoi ke ia. No ka mea, maupopi a kako ma ke la i ka makahiki umi kuma walu kanaha kuma kolu. Wa kua hawa ia no hoi. Hoi ke ia ka mana o ko kako po e kupuna. Malalo o ke ali inui o kaui ke aoli kamehameha e kolu. No ke la nui o hoi ka la ku ʻokoʻa no leila. E no kako, e no wau no hoi. Ma maui nei, mahalo no hoi. Ya ukoa pau ka nana ana mai ke kakayaka me ka holohi pu ana no hoi. No leila. Aloha, Velina. Aloha, I'd like to thank everybody on this honorable day, this day of honor, really. We should always celebrate and acknowledge November 28, 1843. And I kind of, looking back, and I'm sure many of the other speakers, Keanu and others also, we come from the time when I remember back in the, quite a long time ago, I mean, in the 90s, mid-90s perhaps, having gatherings, actually even before that, early 90s, having gatherings on campus at the University of Hawaii Manoa, and you'll be less than a room, maybe a dozen people would come to celebrate and share and talk and acknowledge what went on in 1843. However, today, this has, because of the educational work and because of all of our people coming together and really waking up and being aware of our history, it has come to become, something that we see happening not just on Oahu, perhaps, or not just on Maui, but really worldwide at this point. And so I want to also aloha to all our cousins in Ho'ohana outside for joining us this morning also, And so I'm very, very honored and privileged, and, mahalo to Kale and the whole gang for putting this on. And, unfortunately, we're not physically all together as we commonly are on this day. But however, we struggle on and we teach on, and we continue on our work. Of course, we continue on this great and important work. So I'm going to share a little bit about what I've been kind of thinking about and working on quite recently. And as many of you know, I consider myself an educator, and really, and as an educator, I've always believed and continue to believe the most important element, what is foundational about really what has been going on and what is really going on now and really is going to happen in the future, is the increased levels of our own education. And when I mean own education, our control and our determining for ourselves what is important, what it is to be a so-called educated Kanaka to this day. And so, as they say, without any kind of further ado, we kind of just look at, I got some notes here I'm going to be referring to. I want to talk about what I call the topic, what's called Hoʻokanaka, and something I've been using. And just to kind of break down the word Hoʻokanaka, we should, of course, we hear the word Kanaka, we hear the word Ho'o, and Ho'o basically means to cause, to make happen. The word Kanaka, of course, we as the Kanaka, the human beings. And so there's a plurality in meaning here, a multitude of ideas that are said when pronouncing this word Ho'okanaka. On one level, just like the boy Samoa, our cousins from Samoa say, fa'a Samoa, which is to behave and act and think in a Samoan way, to do things in a so-called the Samoan way. And very much on one simple level, that is what the word Ho'okanaka means. Yet it's even in the Hawaiian conscious, it's a little even more deeper in a sense also. As I was taught when the so-called royal guards who were protecting the palace during the time of Kalakaua and of course Lili'u Okalani, they would have an actual patch on their shoulder that they would wear, and on the shoulder, in fact, the words Ho'okanaka would be inscribed. And that's because the word Ho'okanaka also means basically to be brave, to man up, to be what you need to be, to be brave. And that's really what this is all about, is to be brave. Ho'okanaka, I use it with the word also to become human, to cause ourselves to proclaim our so-called humanity, which means that we have not just the right to, but in fact we have the kuleana and the responsibility to, as Kanaka, to proclaim our humanity to the rest of the world. I probably should say reclaim our humanity from those who oppress and occupy our lands to this day. And from that word Ho'okanaka, some of you know I commonly talk about what I call Hawaiian Consciencism. Using the word Hawaiian. And again, I don't want to define the word Hawaiian into anything particular. As we know, it has various meanings depending on how it's being used and at what time of history. But again, when we think about who and what is, I should say, Hawaiian, it can encompass all of the above. And then the words conscientism, sounds like a fancy word. Conscientism comes from the word conscience. To have a conscience, to know what is right or wrong on one hand, to be conscious, right, to be aware, to be awake, consciousness, and really, this process of raising the critical consciousness of our people. And you notice the word ism, conscientism, which gives it a kind of sense of being a program, a theory, a doctrine, a system of power. And in other words, this is a systematic approach to so-called educating and raising the consciousness of our lāhui Kanaka. And so on this honorable day, what better way to honor the works of our kupuna, of course, but to speak about the consciousness of our so-called, kupuna. The great Malcolm X, who in fighting for the rights of his peoples, and in fact, if you really know Malcolm X, you realize Malcolm X was really fighting for the rights of all peoples. And he has a great quote when he talks about in his work, his great work as an organizer. And we must remember, Malcolm X, in fact, was such an important educator, but really an organizer also. And in his organizing attempts, he talks about what he calls the greatest mistake. And he's asked, basically the issues that are going on. And so, a few weeks before his death, before he's actually assassinated in 1965, he's asked this question. about organizing. And he basically, he says that the greatest mistake has been trying to organize a sleeping people. Think about that. A sleeping people around specific goals. Yeah. And he says you have to first wake them up. Yeah, wake them up. Then you get action. And the reporter says, wake them up to what? To the exploitation, right? How badly you're being treated, to exploitation. He says, no, to their humanity, to their own worth, to their heritage. And then you get action. And you see, in today's world, this is why this is such a foundational element. In order for people to take charge, to become again self-determining, to become again in control of our destiny, a critical element, of course, is ourselves to understand our own humanity, our own heritage. And so many times when we talk about so-called politics, before we can talk about so-called Hawaiian politics, we got to understand, we have to truly start to understand the meaning of what it is to so-called be Hawaiian. And this is a very important element in this so-called rebirth, resurgence, and revitalization of who we are as Kanaka. And in fact, it's an essential tool and element in this struggle for our so-called liberation as a people. The great Harriet Tubman, some of you might have heard of her recently, as did a movie about her. And of course, she was famous for rescuing so-called fellow slaves where she had escaped herself from. And then she had gone back over and over, gone back home, where she was raised on so-called slave plantations to rescue so-called slaves from the plantations and take them up north. And part of her journey and story was many times when she would go to rescue so-called slaves from the clutches of slavery, she wasn't able to really free them. As she said that, she freed 1,000 slaves. Yeah, she freed 1,000 slaves, and she would have freed 1,000 more if they only knew that they were so-called slaves. That the power of the system, what it does, of course, it erases your any sense really of truly who you are. So when you think about how that relates to our people, there are still many and many of our people, thousands of our people that are still asleep, thousands of our people who have yet to really understand their own humanity, have yet to really understand their condition, have yet to understand the condition of our lands being a so-called occupied territory under the United States of America. And so when we talk about what do we do as a lāhui Kanaka to go into the future, what's more important than really, first of all, talking about what we should do is first we must establish what have we done? Who are we today? Because if we do not know at all, or if we only have a superficial understanding of who we are as a people of the past, then we can only have a superficial understanding of who we will become in the future, you see. But if we truly understand a lot more about our history, see, this is the point, and this is why days like this are so important. When I grew up as a young man, and many of those who are speaking, when we grew up as a young person, when I went to school as a young man, we had no idea of what happened on November 28, 1843. We had no idea that our people celebrated the sovereignty and independence as a nation state, as part of the world. We had no idea that our kupuna had international relations with the great powers of the world, that they in fact had become part of the so-called family of nations. That was all deprived from our humanity. That was erased and taken from us, erased and taken from our parents and grandparents' generation. And how was this done? By so-called miseducation. See, so therefore, what is the remedy to miseducation? But re-education of ourselves. It is about us taking control and re-educate and waking us, our people, to our conditions. See, just like Harriet Tubman, you cannot go and so-called save our lāhui or lead our lāhui to a great future if you cannot, first of all, awaken our people to these great historical moments. And that's why days like this, when I look at how we have gone from a room filled of 12 people at the University of Hawaii, acknowledging what went on in 1843, to today we have worldwide broadcasts And you can see the point is that we are waking up. We have waken up. And this, in fact, is the most important. This is why we do what we do today. And so, many times we get taught. See, we get taught. We have been told, oh, it's too bad you Hawaiians lost this, and you don't know this, and you haven't gotten this. And you get trained in this idea that somehow we are less than, that somehow, too bad, we've lost. And the truth is, yes, we have lost lots of our so-called humanity in this so-called illegal occupation, in this indoctrination and coercive assimilation process through the miseducation of our minds. But yet, I always thank great uncle Anakala Kaʻanana, one of my great teachers, who used to teach us, and he would commonly use those words, li'u ikapa'akai, li'u ikapa'akai. Yeah, and the word li'u means to be like well salted. Yeah, and he was referring to just like the fish, right? You go and as a person from Miloli'i, when they would catch fish, right? They dry the fish, they salt the fish, yeah, kaula'i to save for the future day, into the future. And that was the same way that he looked at what was around for us today, as so-called young people back then. That everything we needed to survive, and not just survive, but to thrive into the future, is already here. That our kupuna did such a great job in seasoning all this knowledge and putting it out there so that one day in the future, that we, in fact, would just like our kupuna, li'u ikapa'akai. You could take that fish, you can dust off, take off a little bit of salt, wash it down with some water, re-prepare it, and then use it for today. And he would always say, you learn to bring water into a lo'i. We still have thousands, literally, of fields, our lo'i, still upon our lands, up in the valleys. You want to learn how to do fish farming, aquaculture, yeah, lokoʻa. The lokoʻa, thankfully, are still there. And anybody who knows who flew over the southern end of Molokai, you can look down and see all the great technological advances of our kupuna in setting up the so-called fish farms. It's still there. You want to learn our history, you want to learn our language, you want to learn our mo'oka'au or mo'olelo. We have thousands, if not millions, of pages of Hawaiian language material that fortunately today you can read from any place around the world. Wali'u ikapa'akai. So, first lesson is to realize the glass is not half empty. That in fact, the glass is half full because of the great deeds of our kupuna who have left us this great treasure. And it's only us who must need to. But when we study history, we must also remember, as Amos Wilson, a famous black psychologist, would talk about, we gotta remember that we're not looking for just this feel-good history. It's not about just reading some stuff about our kupuna and just feeling good about ourselves. Because if that's all it is about, if it's just to make yourself feel good, well, I'm sorry, you're going to remain powerless. We're going to remain homeless. We're going to remain without any political, economic power and remain smiley and happy. And for him, his whole thing was history is not something just to make you feel good. History has to be the fuel so that you can do good. And see, that's the point. Not just to know, but to do. And the power of what history really is about is the power to define, as what Amos Wilson will also say too. Yeah. Those who have the power to define have the power. So I want you to think about how we have been manipulated in many times and how we are allowed to accept others' definition of what is to be defined. And then when this is imposed on us, no challenges. When this is the first step, is that we must always remember is to challenge these concepts to define for our own selves. Let me give you an example, right? We get told, you want to be Native Americans? What does that mean? What is a Native Hawaiian? Small n. What is a Native Hawaiian? Big N. Who decided to create those definitions? See, as the great Foucault always said, a French philosopher, yeah, to define is to limit. The purpose of their defining upon us these ideas, why do they define this? It's because it's about control. It's about political control. So the first step is to reject their definition of what that is for us. It is us who must redefine for ourselves in today's context what those ideas mean. So it's a very, again, very important element in understanding. So when you look at our history, when we look at ideas, think about modern context in today. When you think about ideas, like a wahi kapu, or this idea in, that one of the parts of this debate, of course, was, is Mauna Kea really sacred? Again, the idea is sacred. Who are they to define for us what is sacred? How have we come to lose our minds and lose our consciousness that we would even consider that they somehow have a right to define for us? The National Science Foundation, Congress, the president of the university, that they will, again, you can see, if they define for us, we have already conceded control in our destiny to them. So it's very important all the time when we look at these kinds of days, as we learn our history, all these fantastic researchers and great speakers that are coming up. This is in effect what's going on. We, in fact, are not just investigating for ourselves, but then again, defining for ourselves what these words actually mean. What do the context of what they meant, especially more importantly, what they mean for us today. John Henry Clarke, also another famous African-American historian, he has that, he talks about history and says, people, the powerful people cannot afford to educate the people that they oppress. Because once you are truly educated, think about it, what does it mean? Not miseducated, but once you are truly educated, you will not ask for power, you will take it. Because as a man thinketh in his heart, so will he be. And that's why the control of our minds is the key to our so-called liberation. And we got to kind of always remember that this is part of this story. They try to sell us certain kinds of ideas or narratives. Brother Skippy Ioane, in his favorite, one of his favorite, my favorite songs as he sings with Big Island Conspiracy. He has a one line in the song, which to me is a genius. He's a genius. Them got democracy, we got survive. Them got democracy, we got survive. It's a clash of world political narratives. In their minds, if they give us the right to testify, write in letters, you can vote, therefore you are being included and everything should be good and you should say nothing. But yet that is not the true condition of our people. For our people, our survival as a people depends on our ability to control our so-called destiny, or I should say re-control our so-called destiny. We must control our education. So we are not here with the idea that we're trying to incorporate ourselves into their power structure. No. That without our aina, without control of our water, without control of our economics, without control of our aesthetics, we will continue to be under the control of our so-called dominators and oppressors. Which is another thing to remember. When we analyze the situation, we must remember we are a so-called dominated people. We're in a condition of being dominated, meaning that there is a dominator who controls in many ways what can or may happen upon these lands. So already within the power structure, we must already analyze the situation in a very honest way. That whatever is going on in Hawaii is always through the lens of an occupied nation state. That we are being dominated. There's somebody thousands of miles away that is calling the shots upon our people. And we cannot get trapped or lost into this discussion to somehow believe that we are part of the so-called democratic process. Their democracy is an illegal occupation of our lands, and more importantly, an illegal occupation of our minds. many years ago, I don't say how many, I mean, I'll probably say decades ago, I was doing some research, and I was very heavy into doing work, especially in our, we call mo'oali'i, mo'okuauhau, mo'oakua, our cosmogonies, hokumu honua, hokumu aina, and my favorite historian, Joseph Moku'uhai Poipoi, in 1906, writing for Kana'iaupuni. Anyway, he writes this quote, and I'm just going to read a piece of it. In Mo'olelo Kahiko, and he says, "E ho maupopo ia, he lāhui kako me ko kako mo'olelo kahiko." Yeah, hey, we should realize, let it be known, hey, that we are a nation, we are people with our own ancient traditional stories. I ano like loa aku me ka mo'olelo kahiko ka lāhui o Helene. It's kind of similar with the ancient histories of Greece. Now you gotta understand. So in European idea, Greece is the homeland. Yeah, Greece is the starting point. But he's saying, he's comparing our own history in much to the Greeks, right? If the Greeks are the classics, in other words, he's saying, hey, we have classics. Ahe mau mele kahiko ho'i, ka ko kako mau kupuna, iliki aku a I oyaku no ho'i, ko lako hiva meke kila. And he says, yeah, and we have, just like the Greeks, we have our own ancient stories, our kupuna had. That wasn't just like and good like the Greeks. This is the clincher. But even better. And to me, when I remember first reading that line, it changed my perspective forever. Because what it showed me was our kupuna knew what we knew, what we had. And so, yeah, they were impressed. The Europeans good. The Greeks, they're good. But look at our kupuna telling us, yeah, they're good. But our stuff is not just as good, even better. And I remember thinking, what a way to see the world. That our kupuna were not like my parents' generation or my early generation, which was somehow taught to believe that nothing came out from these lands here. All we had was surfing, I think, and Mayday. That was it. That was our great contributions to the world. And of course, what you find, that is not the truth at all. That when you study works like the Kumulipo, you start to see the genius of our kupuna. Not as those who, in other words, they did never look at the European and the so-called American as somehow that they had something. And we were somehow less than. But that wasn't the way our kupuna saw who we are. In fact, they saw that what we had here was not just as good, but even better in many ways. And so it really made me start to question and look at history in a very different way. But the role of, when we think about things like language, Jerry Adams, Sinn Féin president, he always talks about the importance of language, right? The Irish language, as he says, that the Irish language is the key. Yeah, that understand the Irish language is the reconquest of Ireland, and the reconquest of Ireland is the Irish language. So the language, of course, holds a key to our identity, our morals, our epistemologies, ontologies. I mean, the way we see the world, how we know what we know. It's a key in many ways to unlock. But it's tied into, it's not just about the revival of the language, you see. It's tied in, of course, the reconquest of Ireland itself. So when we think about why study language, the study of language has to always be, or the study of our arts, the study of our dance, the study of our spirituality, has to always be a part of the political struggle, one, in fact, and the same. When I talk about conscientism, I always tell people I kind of borrow this idea from, four great thinkers, Kwame Nkrumah out of Ghana, one of the leaders in the so-called decolonization struggles in Africa. And, he has a book he writes, in fact, called Conscientism. This is where I so-called borrowed the words. It's a philosophy and ideology of so-called decolonization and liberation for Africa. And here's some monumental ideas that he puts out. And, an important one is, of course, the idea of practice. Practice without thought. Practice without thought is blind. Thought without practice is empty. Yeah, thought without practice is empty. In other words, it's not just good enough just to know, that you must put into practice. But if you're just practicing without having a sense, a clear understanding of why or what you are doing, right, it is also as empty. So when we move forward, it's not just to celebrate today and learn some important facts. But what also is important is that as we understand and all the things that you will learn today, you must learn. And to truly learn is that somehow you must move that to practice. Right? We must move that to exercising the actual practice. Stephen Biko, the great South African thinker and leader, fought apartheid, and he was so powerful and so dangerous to the South Africans that in fact he was killed in so-called prison while being locked up. But he talks about something called black consciousness, that a philosophy of black consciousness. And this is where he comes up with that famous quote: the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Think about that. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor. Think about our minds in their hands. How does that happen? Through miseducation. Yeah. Is the mind of the oppressed. That also tells you what is the most potent weapon that we have as so-called oppressed peoples or dominated peoples, is the re-control of our own minds. And that's why days like this are so important. Paulo Freire, Brazilian educational activist in many ways, and he talks about many important words. He talks about what's called critical practice. And if you're an educator, I hope you have read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, how so-called the oppressed should teach themselves, or how we do teach ourselves. As he says, there's no such thing as neutral education. I repeat, there's no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. Think about that. When we teach ourselves, we are either putting ourselves into a box, or we are freeing ourselves or liberating ourselves from the box. Yeah, there's no such thing as neutral education. So think about the miseducation that has been going on for far too long, for too many decades in places like Hawaii, and how we have been manipulated, bamboozled, and fooled into seeing ourselves in a particular way, not because it empowers us, but more precisely because it disempowers us as a people. And I'm just gonna, again, another important voice in my ideology in kind of creating this philosophy of conscientism is Graham Smith from Aotearoa, Professor Smith, who talks about conscientization, borrowing from Freire, conscious raising. But an important, when I went to listen to him talk about 15 years ago, I heard him talk about, and he talked about, decolonization of the mind. Yeah, in other words, trying to clear our minds from all these misinformation and assimilation ideas. And he said, he didn't like to use the so-called word decolonization because it's a reactive notion, right? You're reacting to what they are doing to you. And so his move was, in fact, in other words, coming from a negative, an or against something, was to transform it into a pro something, which is to conscientization. Yeah, so that's why for me, that's why I use this particular idea. In other words, to take control of a way in which we think, to take control of our reprogramming, re-educating ourselves, our own seeking the so-called truth. Even the great George Helm, the great modern prophet of Aloha Aina, as he says, in his struggle, where he gave his life, of course, that we are in a revolution of consciousness. I repeat, we are in a revolution of consciousness. Again, revolution. To take what is below, to bring above, to transform. But he's not talking revolution, as he says. Of course, revolution like picking up a gun, or revolution in a sense of performing violence, but more specific, revolution of consciousness, to transform our way we think, to wake us all up to who we are. And the bottom line, what we are looking for, as he says, is the truth, the truth, the truth. Think about that. It's actually pretty simple in regards to reprogramming ourselves. Is first to acknowledge that we've been lied to. Not just been lied to, but many of us don't even know that we've been lied to. But what is the la'au? What is the lapa'au? How do we mitigate that? How do we correct? Is to seek the truth. And I read, look for the truth. Yeah, and to constantly look for the truth. And this has led us to kind of remember that, you know, how do we go back home, if you think about it? Yeah. What is our destination? How do we get back there? How have we been taken off course? Where have we been taken? These are the kinds of questions we must answer, right? In order to figure out where we need to go, we have to figure out, first of all, where have we been and where have we been taken? Yeah, because if we don't analyze ourselves to realize where have we been taken, it's a lot harder to figure out where we need to go. Yeah, we may be heading in the wrong direction. And that's why it's always important to take control of our own research and investigations in talking about who we are as a people. And I know I got about a few, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about which I've talked about in the past. I'm sorry, I'm only about halfway of what I was hoping to talk about, but anyway, I some of you might have heard me use the phrase, don't drink the dirty water in the past, and this is, basically that's the same important idea. The great Elijah Muhammad in teaching Malcolm X, and he would talk about, people, if you give them a choice of drinking from a clean glass of water or a dirty glass of water, it's pretty clear which glass people would choose, right? They would choose the clean glass of water. But however, if you have never had access to that clean glass of water, and your whole life all you have drunk from is this dirty glass of water, then you have no idea what a clean glass of water is like. So in an education, the first step is, how do you reveal that the glass of water that perhaps we have been drinking has been dirty, is to, for the first time, show the so-called clean glass of water. And whenever someone would have the opportunity to drink from that clean glass of water, and they taste that clean glass, they will recognize and realize, hey, there's something else that's different. In fact, there's something else that's even better for me. And once you taste that clean glass of water, you will start to reject drinking from that dirty glass of water. But in the same way, it's not as simple as just taking a clean glass of water and pouring that clean water into a dirty glass. Because if the glass is dirty, that what used to be clean will now also become contaminated from that dirt. So we think about learning about our history. It's not enough just to add all this good information and knowledge of our kupuna into our brains and into our hearts, if at the same time we don't attempt to clean out from us the contaminants. And what are some of those contaminants? Well, of course, white supremacy, the European American ideas that have been implanted based upon these ideas of supremacy has to be interrogated and, in fact, disassembled as we bring in the so-called clean water. So as I say, hey, not just drink that dirty water. In other words, go taste the inuit kawai. By drinking that clean water, you want to drink more. At the same time, we need to do those things to clean out from us those ideas of white supremacy. What are those ideas of white supremacy? There are many, right? Think about when we get trained into our these doctrines, the idea that everything that had came out of so-called Europe that has been brought here. But once you understand your history, right? So we get told this idea, you're lucky the Americans took you guys over in 1893. Yeah, brought liberty and justice for all to you so-called Hawaiians. Well, when you go back and look at our own history, you start to realize, see, when you understand your own history, you start to realize that is a huge fallacy. when you go back and understand history, you start to realize when Kamehameha III in 1840, that when they put forward the first Hawaiian Constitution, written by the way in Lahaina, on this island of Maui, and that first Constitution was pushed forward. And it said that all men were created equal, that all bloods were equal. When our kupuna said that, it was true and real. Because in Hawaii, in the Hawaiian kingdom, no one is discriminated against because of the language they spoke, or their religion perhaps, or even more precisely their color of the skin. Now, not to say we did not have prejudices and discriminations for people's sexuality and other things. And I don't have time to kind of go deeper into that question, but we got to realize, now what is that in compared to what is going on in the United States in 1840? In 1840, they still just began the genocidal campaigns going across Central Plains area of the United States. American Indians were being murdered, erased physically. And they want to talk equality? Black slaves were still being held in bondage. And they're talking about liberty and justice for all? My point is to understand those kinds of ideas of freedom and liberty was not something that the Americans brought here. That's something that came from here. And in fact, it was the opposite that was imposed here after the so-called invasion of 1893. When you think about the role of women, things were not perfect in the Hawaiian Kingdom, far from it. But we do know even the first Constitution was signed by Kekauanohi, Kamehameha's granddaughter, who was what? A woman. In 1840, it was a woman on behalf, as the Kuhina Nui, on behalf of the Hawaiian Kingdom government that signed the so-called Constitution. So again, when we think about these ideas, we got, again, going back to this, we got to remember, humanity was not something that came in 1893. Humanity, that was something that was taken from us in 1893. And this humanity can only be reclaimed by us in 2020 today. And this is done through these political myths that were imposed upon our people and our minds. So when you get think, they teach us about Adam and Eve. And you think about Adam and Eve as two white people running around eating an apple off a tree. Of course, we all should know that genetically it is impossible to come from so. We all come from, in fact, having DNA from Africa. That's a scientific fact. When you think about the images that have been imposed on our brains, right? Many of our people have been foolishly taught to somehow believe that, Jesus was a white-looking, long-haired, blonde-looking guy with blue eyes who walked around in Palestine. And of course, that is the furthest from the truth. Even the image of Jesus was something that was manipulated to become white. In fact, if you go, and don't believe anything I say, you go out and search for yourself. Jesus became white as part of this fraud, a part of this idea of creating this false image. For what? To capture within our minds somehow to believe that everything so-called good comes from the European. But if you go and look at the truth again, that's why I said, as the great one said, then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So what is the goal? To seek the truth. When they tell us that Columbus discovered America, or Captain Cook discovered Hawaii, what does it mean, Captain Cook discovered Hawaii? That we were not human beings prior to the coming of Captain Cook? How come our children are taught this mental filth even to this day? We should understand our own history, that we were sailing across our kupuna, thousands of miles of open ocean, while many of the so-called Europeans, as I say, still lived in caves. That is a fact. So we do not come from people who were somehow behind and needed to become civilized and needed somehow become to join the world of those who were in the know. In fact, when you understand our own history, you start to really, first of all, realize, no, we come from a very advanced people. And when you come to understand what was going on in the Hawaiian kingdom in 1800s, you start to realize how more advanced our people were. Look at Kamehameha III, and I'm going to give my shout out to my brother. Donovan's going to talk later. When Kamehameha III divided up the lands, yeah, to what we call the Mahele, and he gave a 1/3 interest to the so-called Hoʻaina, the native tenants of the land. As we say, that's a bloodless revolution. Where else in history, where else, name any of the European countries where the so-called king or queen gave the so-called common people a 1/3 interest of all lands? See, that's not regression, that is progression of society. When people try to compare our ali'i with the ali'i of Europe, you gotta first understand our ali'i truly love their people. Now, they're not perfect either, but it's clear to understand. My point is that these are not things that we've learned from the outside. These are things that are so-called from our own land and our own grounds. And so when we think about our path to the future, mental colonization, I'm talking mental colonization, is a program. Now, what is the purpose of the program? When the so-called mental control programming occurred, they didn't do it to us because they hated our language. They didn't wipe out our history because they didn't like what we said. The purpose of the erasure, the purpose of the mental domination was about what? Was for them to secure their control and continued exploitation of our lands and our resources. See, so that's why I always tell people, when we talk about revival of our culture, if you're not truly dealing with the return of our people to control our own destiny or to regain control of our own lands, then you are not really correcting the situation. I want you guys to think about that. Why in 1896 was the Hawaiian language banned as a medium of education in the Hawaiian Islands? Was it because Hawaiian language could not do a high-level education? That's false. The history speaks to that. The purpose of our deculturation was not the goal. Deculturation, coercive assimilation, is a tactic, right? That's only a tactic. Because in the true desire, what they wanted, of course, was the control of our lands. And how do they best control our lands? But first to control our minds, you see. And that's why, again, fundamentally, we must at all times take on this kuleana, to reclaim our minds. As the great Kwaipuna Prejean used to say, don't worry about the chains on your legs. You should worry first about the chains on your brains. Because once they have your chains on your brains, they don't have to put the chains on your legs, you see. You will become tamed. You will become submissive. You will accept their so-called dominance. In fact, you'll be taught to not to question. In fact, you start to teach your own selves, our own selves, not to question and to accept. Right? So deculturalization, yeah, is a purpose, again, to accept this condition, to become complicit in our own domination. And so what is this crusade in many ways in which we must re-begin? Is to reverse menticide. Yeah, to reverse that purpose of menticide was to what? So they can hide their plundering and to hide their so-called domination. Yeah, in fact, we accepted, and as the great Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, to understand that theft is holy. That somehow what has happened to our people was lucky. You should be proud and happy that it was the Americans that have invaded you. You know, you could be speaking a foreign language. And of course, this thing we should realize, this had nothing to do with bringing civilization. We already had civilization. It had nothing to do with bringing our people rights. We already had rights. It had nothing to do with bringing our level of humanity to a higher level. We already were world renowned for that. It had to do with the control, oppression, and dominance of our lands and people. And so when we think about how to reverse what has happened to our people, it is through re-education of our people. It is for us to regain control of our minds. And only we, as Kwame Ture also says, only through our culture, it's only through our own culture, through our own understanding of history, our own spirituality, that we can so-called rescue ourselves. We can never look to the so-called oppressor or dominator to somehow believe that they have the plan and the medicine to fix what they did to us, which have benefited us, which has disempowered us. In fact, the reverse is true. The first step is for us to acknowledge that we have to reclaim for ourselves this task. And I know I'm heading towards probably at the end of my talk. Like I said, I wish I had I only went through half, but in the end, I just want us to celebrate this day, not to celebrate today just to make us feel good, but the celebration of this day is to acknowledge what our kupuna had accomplished. Because once we understand what they had accomplished, and think about that, this great hero, Ha'alilio, traveling all the way to Europe, and then being able to get recognized by the powers to be at that time. This little country, little bunch of islands, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, becomes a recognized nation state. The first non-European and the only Pacific peoples to have gained that so-called recognition. But what it shows you is that we can accomplish anything, just like our kupuna. If they can, we can. So when you hear the voices of those that some are, oh, we best just take what we can get. I don't come from that kind of Kanaka. That was never the way of my kupuna. My kupuna expected the best. My kupuna expected the best in regards to humanity. My kupuna accomplished. And if they can accomplish, we can accomplish. So we think about things like Mauna Kea and the fight over Mauna Kea. When we were told, how dare, who the hell do you guys think you guys are? You think you can stop this multi-billion-dollar project from the powers to be? And our response was, stop? Yeah, yes, no. But I know we will stand. And I thought, ku'oko'a, remember this. La ku'oko'a. In order to be ku'oko'a, you got to ku first. Ku, stand. Ea mai Hawaii nui kia. Aloha nui kako and mahalo nui and happy hau'oli la ku'oko'a to everybody.